being both dyslexic and ADHD, I am very good at being a generalist. I'm very good at doing many things at the same time. And what writing a book does is it makes you go very deep and become an expert. And that's really important for not just those with dyslexia or ADHD, but creatives in general.
It's the Inspiration Place podcast with artist Miriam Schulman. Welcome to the Inspiration Place podcast, an art world insider podcast for artists by an artist, where each week we go behind the scenes to uncover the perspiration and inspiration behind the art. And now, your host, Miriam Schulman.
Today we have a dyslexic serial entrepreneur, philanthropist, and investor who grew up in London's East End, where he was told by teachers he wouldn't amount to anything. Despite leaving school with no qualifications, he started multiple businesses, became a multimillionaire in his 20s, and featured in a prime-time TV show that followed him starting his first business. Our guest today decided to write this Dyslexic Edge, which challenges the narrative that views dyslexia as a deficit or impediment to success, presenting compelling research and case studies from interviewing some of the world's most successful dyslexics to demonstrate quite the opposite. Please welcome to the Inspiration Place, Jamie Waller. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being given the platform to talk.
Well, you're a good fit for my audience because, as I told you before we hit record, this is a show primarily for creatives and entrepreneurs. And there's quite a lot of neurodiversity among my audience, as you point out in the opening of your book. I don't know if you know that stat off the top of your head. I wasn't surprised by it at all, though. You said something like 40% of entrepreneurs, something like that?
So 35% of entrepreneurs are dyslexic, 40% of self-made millionaires, but unfortunately, so are 50% of the US prison population. So there's still some work to do.
It could go either way.
It can go either way. Well, you can imagine sort of the characteristics of an entrepreneur are, that very much go out and get it. And if you're going out and getting it, it's because you're from a ghetto or a place where you just don't see any other way out. And that going out and getting it might be robbing a bank or robbing somebody. It's unfortunate, but it's the reality.
Well, it's also, I don't know if you'll agree with this, but I feel it's much easier for me to take risks than somebody who is neurotypical. And let me just back things up for those who have not been listening to my podcast forever and have not digested every word of my book, and for Jamie himself, who doesn't really know me that well. So when I was in college, I was diagnosed with, we're not PC back then, we did call them learning disabilities.
Yep.
And I was told it was not exactly dyslexia. It was audiological processing, which causes me to mix up like digits, numbers. I'm the queen of malpropisms. I will, it's a good thing I'm not running for president. Let's just put it that way. So I like my word retrieval is terrible. So I was diagnosed actually in college, which meant that I was compensating all that time. So I actually, fortunately, never did see myself as you did as not being bright. I didn't see myself that way, but I did always know I had this thing where if I wasn't careful, things could go really bad. So that was my experience. When did you discover that you were dyslexic?
Well, I guess, dyslexia, I was born in 1979. Dyslexia wasn't really a thing. We were all just convinced that we were not as bright as the rest of our peers. I knew that I was different from a very young age, 8 or 9. I knew I was dyslexic probably at the age 15, 16, when I simply couldn't sit any GCSEs, which was our sort of standard leaving school exams. But to be honest with you, I spent the next 20 years trying to hide it because I honestly thought that if I was discovered, I wouldn't do well in business. And, I just wanted to be, I grew up in a very poor part of London. My parents were very poor. So I just simply wanted to be successful and rich. So I spent the next 20 years trying to hide it. And it was only when I was 36, I sold my first business for $75 million that I felt confident enough to go, okay, you know what? actually, I am dyslexic. And so what? This is my story. And I really felt a big pull towards helping others because when I call it the day I came out, when I came out, it was a huge weight lifted off my shoulders. It was like being born again. It was just remarkable. And the fact that I carried it around for 36 years, not feeling that I could just come out and tell the truth, was just horrendous. So, the main drive behind the book is to give people the confidence to either have their children tested, get themselves tested, have their parents tested. One of the conversations I have quite a lot lately is, if you think your parents might be dyslexic, give them the benefit of knowing that before they go to their grave, because they're not stupid. They're not any less able. Dyslexia does not equal low IQ. I feature dyslexics within the book that have MBAs from some of the most famous, well-renowned universities on earth. The reality is that dyslexia is nothing more than a badge that's been given to people that learn differently.
Yeah. And I think in your book, it can acknowledge that a lot of people who have dyslexia probably also have other things going on, like ADHD or like me, audiological processing or something out, that there's usually like a mixture. It's not only one thing. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. And I think it's really important that you point that out, because a lot of people say, well, what are the traits of dyslexic people? And if you capture somebody like me that's dyslexic and ADHD, it could be quite easy for me to cross over from my experiences. And they might not be solely related to dyslexia. They might be my traits that are more aligned to ADHD. So one of the things I did with this book is I went out and interviewed a number of academics, and we came across a professor at Cambridge University here in the UK who was dyslexic herself. And I decided to work with her on this book because it was really important that we told the reader the truth. What I find a lot with books these days is people can go out and, put pen to paper, and all of a sudden people that read it believe it is factual. It was really important for me to make sure that we tested everything, so we weren't giving information to people that simply wasn't correct.
So that brought me to my next question. So I see you co-wrote it with somebody. How much of a challenge was your dyslexia in writing?
So this is my second book. My first one published in 2017. But I think the dyslexia part, I love writing. I'm a creative. I'm curious creative. So for me, actually, the fact that I can't spell well doesn't prevent me from penning. What I pen to paper is very readable. Actually, I used to once write for Forbes, the business magazine, a monthly column. And they were always blown away that I just did this in sort of 20 minutes and it would be publishable straight away, because I can get my thoughts and my creativity onto paper really well. What was much more difficult for me, and I think it's more aligned to my ADHD than it is my dyslexia, is I then become obsessive about the editing process. So I read this book before it went to print. I must have read this book, and this is no exaggeration, I would say every chapter in this book has been read by me over 200 times. And I obsess over making it readable. It should have an average reading age of 11 is what I aimed for in this book. Is what we're about to say matter? Are we putting words down for the sake of words? How do you get to what you're trying to say in the quickest possible way to keep people's attention? And that bit for me is difficult because it means with my obsession, I don't sleep much and I just get into it and into it and into it. And some days I could be sat there for, not often, but more than a handful of times, I could be sat in one place for 20 odd hours in a stretch, simply getting up to move to the fridge and then coming back, eating while still editing and stuff like that. So it's not healthy for somebody like me to write a book too often. I published one in 2017. This one's published in 2024. Every time I do it, I say it's going to be the last time I do it, but who knows?
Yeah. Well, so I published my book in January 23, and I thought I would never, ever do it again. And now I've been working on a book proposal, and it is taking me 9 months to work on the book proposal. I mean, some of that is just like, I will go stretches where thinking this is a terrible idea and nobody wants to read this book. And why does this matter at all?
Yeah.
And then I remember why it's important, and then I will work on it. And I don't think I read it, my chapters 200 times, but that's quite a lot, actually. But I would read it out loud every single time. And every single time it came back from, even once it was quote unquote done, like it came back from the copy edit, I was making changes. And there was like the third pass where they said, well, they accidentally didn't tell me that it was ready. I was like, wait, isn't this due now? And they're like, oh, well, yeah, that's right. Here it is. And we need it by whatever it was, Monday, and it was Friday. I was like, no, that's not enough time. They're like, no, it's going to printer on Monday. Yeah. I was like, okay. Right. Like, too bad. The curtain's going up on this. So too bad for you.
It's interesting, isn't it, Miriam? Because there are so many easier forms of media now for us to use to get across the same message, right? So I could, for example, spend 2 weeks doing podcasts and probably get across a lot of the same message. So why would you choose to do a book?
Okay. So let's talk about that. Because I want to see if your reason is similar to mine. I suspect it is from what you said about being a curious creative. I find that I get my answers by writing the book. Like it makes my message stronger by being forced to read it out loud, by sharing it with an editor who says, you didn't connect the dots here. Where I see the dots are connected in my mind because of the way I think, and I think differently than other people, but I didn't put that on paper. What about you? Is it?
Yeah, no, exactly the same. And actually, I think it forces me to, with being both dyslexic and ADHD, I am very good at being a generalist. I'm very good at doing many things at the same time. And what writing a book does is it makes you go very deep and become an expert. And that's really important for not just those with dyslexia or ADHD, but creatives in general. If you want to become an expert, it takes a different mindset than maybe going into a room, whiteboarding, going into an interview, standing up on stage, telling an audience your message.
Yeah. And it's, with the podcast, we can let our ADHD kind of run the show. Our listeners don't care if we're jumping from one topic to the next. They're okay with that. But the book kind of chains you to know this is the idea that you have to talk about. Yeah. And you have to go deep. So like you said, this is what forces you to go deep. But the other thing I said, or how I feel about it, is it helps me tap into the wisdom of the universe. Do you get that as well, or no?
I'm not too sure. I think what it does because of the way my book is structured, actually both my books are structured where we're interviewing other people and telling their stories as well. What it definitely does, it makes me seriously consider other people's circumstances and opinions. So, for example, when you write a book on dyslexia, it is fairly easy to find 75-year-old white men with dyslexia say, but it didn't do me any harm. Look at me now. Now, I don't think that's a useful piece of information to get across because it's almost saying we'll just continue as we have done. And also, I honestly believe that, yes, I was born poor with dyslexia and ADHD, but I was born white, British, speaking English with ADHD. And if you take another person I interviewed for this book, Chef Philly is the winner of MasterChef. She comes from Indian heritage. She was going home going, Mom, I think I'm dyslexic. And Indians are so focused on education that she was simply told, don't be stupid, just work harder. That was very different for her to deal with her dyslexia. Or Wilfred, who goes under the brand The Black Farmer. Wilfred emigrated to the UK from Jamaica as one of 7. So his experience of dealing with dyslexia, being an immigrant in a 2-bedroom flat in a very poor part of the UK, was extremely different. Or to connect back to the US, Paul Orfler, the owner of Kinko Print. I went and interviewed Kinko Print, Paul, an immigrant, and but from a very middle-class background, who had quite a sort of a pleasant experience of growing up with dyslexia. And I think it's really important. And I would never have, unless I did the book, I was in grave danger of being the same narrow-minded person of, thinking that my circumstances were the same as everybody else's. And I think that that's just not that useful. So what I get out of this creative process is it enlightens me. It gives me a sense of real understanding, and it makes me have a wider lens on the world and everybody that it impacts. I was really 100% focused on having diversity across the book in sex, in race, in age, in what they do, how they made their money, how they became successful. And that was, I think, the most rewarding thing I could have done, for not just for my own self, but for the reader.
Yeah, it was very obvious. And I definitely appreciated that, because in the art world, there's so many books I pick up and there's not a single woman in them. And that doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
Or maybe Georgia O'Keeffe is the only one, and it doesn't have to be that way. So yeah, we definitely appreciate that. When we come back, we'll be discussing what exactly is the dyslexic edge. But first, these words.
So you're pouring your heart into each piece, but how do you get it seen by the right people? It's more than just racking up likes.
Absolutely. It's about genuine visibility, the kind that leads to real opportunities.
And that's why we're taking this deep dive into Miriam Schulman's approach. She has this workshop, Visibility Tactics to Attract the Right Collectors. And we're going to unpack some of her core strategies so you walk away with, actual things you can use. Think of it like a backstage pass, even if you're not signing up.
I love that. And the first thing you might see on that backstage pass, she tells artists, look beyond social media.
Whoa, really? Ditch the platforms everyone's glued to. Oh,
It's about being strategic. Think about it. Are serious art collectors scrolling Instagram for their next big purchase?
I don't think so.
Exactly. Schulman wants artists to be where those collectors already are.
Okay, so put yourself in front of the right eyes. But what about that hurdle of becoming, in demand?
Honestly, the magic is in understanding what in demand really means. It's attracting those collectors who connect with your style. The ones who look at your art and they're like, I need to have that. Right. And that actually brings up another point of Schulman's: confidence. It's so easy to feel like an imposter.
Imposter syndrome is real. You start to wonder if you're even an artist.
Yeah.
So how does Schulman help artists work through that, step into the spotlight, but authentically?
She helps them build a personal brand that feels real, not some fake persona, but really owning your style. She even tells artists they're not for everyone, and that's okay.
Whoa, I like that. How does that work with art collecting?
Schulman teaches artists to weave their story, their inspirations, even their struggles into their art.
So you're not just selling a painting, you're selling an experience.
Exactly. And Schulman's got real results.
How do you actually get in front of these collectors? It's got to be more than just posting on Instagram at this point, right?
Oh, absolutely. This is where Schulman's strategies for publicity come in.
Because it's about quality over quantity.
Exactly. Schulman talks about finding your niche, those key influencers.
So you found your art world VIPs. Then what? Just slide into their DMs with a, hey, check out my art. I'm guessing it takes a little more than that.
It does. Remember all that personal story stuff we were talking about?
Yeah.
That's important.
So you need to connect with them on a human level, not just like a business deal. But how do you do that? I mean, you want to showcase your work, but not just bombard someone you don't even know.
Right. Schulman says, start by building a real connection. Follow their work, engage with what they do. Maybe you go to gallery openings or join an online art community.
Become part of the conversation, not just shouting from the sidelines.
Yes. And when you do reach out, make it personal. Mention something specific that you connected with about their work. Let them know you're not just sending this to anyone.
Okay, so no generic emails. Got it. But how do you go from there to talking about your art?
Schulman talks about having a elevator pitch ready. It's like a short, captivating summary of your work, your vision.
Something that makes someone say, tell me more. It's about knowing your audience and speaking to what they care about.
Exactly. And don't forget, networking is a two-way street. Think about what you can offer them too. Maybe you share their work with your followers, or you could even collaborate. It's about building a relationship where you both benefit.
So it's a win-win. You get exposure. They get to connect with a talented artist like you. It feels a lot less scary when you think about it that way.
And you know what else Schulman says can help with that fear? And remember, it's a process. It's not like you become this overnight sensation. It's more about constantly putting yourself out there, building those connections.
So it's a marathon, not a sprint. You need a strategy to get to the finish line. And that brings us back to what Schulman's saying in her workshop, right? It's not just about being a good artist.
Right.
You have to be strategic about getting people to see your work. It's about taking control of your own art career. And even if you don't end up taking Schulman's workshop, we want you to walk away with some things you can actually use.
Absolutely. So here's something to think about. What's one thing, even something small, that you can do this week to boost your visibility?
Maybe it's finally updating that website or sending a personal email to a gallery owner. You could even just practice your elevator pitch in the mirror.
Exactly. The important thing is to start somewhere.
Because your art deserves to be seen.
It does.
Okay, that wraps up our deep dive into art and visibility. We hope you found it useful.
We did.
It's a journey, not a race. Be bold, be strategic.
All right, my friends. So if you want to join me for the visibility workshop, it's really an audience building workshop using tactics to really get yourself out there and be seen. I would love to have you join me. It isn't free, by the way. I am charging just a small amount just to make sure that it's live, it's interactive, and you get the most you can out of working with me. So head on over to schulmanart.com/audience. You can learn a little bit more about it, and hopefully I'll see you at the workshop. Okay, and now back to the inspiration place. Well, let's just get to the heart of it. What is the dyslexic edge? So we're talking about, we have dyslexia, you wrote a book, you interviewed people, they have it too, and they were successful. But what was the one or two things that gave them the edge because of the dyslexia or their other neurodivergence? We don't have to limit it to just that.
It's a great question. And it's worth pointing out, actually, I don't think I've told this story, but when I started the book, it was going to be called Dyslexic Entrepreneur, and we were just going to focus on entrepreneurs because the statistics are there in your face. 35% of them are dyslexic. But actually, it was when I started working with Dr. Helen Taylor, and I really dived into the research that she's been doing for the last 22 years, and her research is nothing more than just beautiful. So what her hypothesis is that there's two groups of people born into this earth: explorers and exploiters. Pre-500 years ago, when we invented this thing called learning, the exploiters were very highly celebrated. 15% of the population approximately are born explorers. And they would go out, as you would imagine, and find food, find new territories, et cetera, et cetera. And when they were successful, they would bring it back for the exploiters to take advantage of. Now, if you look at the traits of a dyslexic person, they perfectly match to the traits of an explorer. So we are of the opinion that dyslexia is nothing more than a title given to a group of people that just weren't considered when we invented the thing that we now call learning. Now, the process of reading and writing in the main was brought to us by the church. The church were fearful of knowledge drain. People were dying at 30 odd years of age, and they didn't want the story of the Bible to be forgotten. And we created this thing called reading and writing. Some people managed to pick it up reasonably well. Others didn't. We believe that those that didn't were your explorers and those that did were your exploiters. As we progressed into modern day life, we thought, we need to do something about this. No one's willing to rewrite the process of learning. So what we'll do is we'll give them a badge, because if we give them a badge, we can allocate some funding towards it. And if we allocate some funding towards it, it looks like that they've got a disability and we're doing something to help them. So I would say that, the badge of dyslexia is really a badge of the explorer. And the dyslexic thing is just a government's convenient way to pretend to be doing something about it.
Interesting. I remember reading or learning recently that neurodiversity, which includes dyslexia, ADHD, and autism, that these aren't mutations of our species. These evolved as biological strengths that the society needs our abilities in order to evolve and function and grow. So it is a feature of evolution, not a problem of it. So I think it's very important that you called it the dyslexic edge instead of the dyslexic entrepreneur, because you're able to reach people who maybe are in jobs and didn't consider entrepreneurship, or that this is something that they should see as a strength for themselves.
Exactly. And what the book does very well is it's not written for those with dyslexia, it's written for anyone. So those with dyslexia can read it and get comfort in knowing that they don't have a deficit. It's not a disability. But those without dyslexia can pick it up. And quite helpfully, at the end of each chapter, we give a couple of pages of key takeaways on how a neurotypical person might implement dyslexic thinking into their own personal development or their own business growth. And I think that's where we want to get to. We want to get to where people realize that actually, just like having a diverse senior management team made up of both men and women or both young and old, we should also have dyslexic thinkers within those communities too, because they add real value. I mean, if you just think some of the most creative things on earth, I mean, flight, light, the iPhone, all invented by dyslexic thinkers. And the reality is, if we want to resolve climate change, it's probably going to be resolved by a dyslexic thinker. History speaks for itself. And that we should celebrate. I would like to see a world where there are advertisements, job advertisements that are actively recruiting for people with dyslexic thinking skills.
Interesting. One of the chapters I particularly enjoyed focused on Kelly Hoppen, the dyslexic designer. Would you like to share a bit of her story for our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, Kelly I should start by saying she was one of my favorite people to interview. She's simply wonderful. So Kelly is one of the most famous interior designers on earth. She designed David Beckham and Victoria Beckham's place in Miami, Sir Richard Branson's place, I think, out in Switzerland. She's worked for everyone and anyone. But she started her life in South Africa and then moved to the UK. She grew up in a very middle to well-class background. So she had money. Her parents were business owners. So she was surrounded by that. But she was clearly very different in the way she thought and how she behaved. For example, one of the great stories about Kelly is, when she was back in South Africa and she saw that you couldn't have black people in the same hotel as white people. And she, made sure that she booked ahead to get a ground floor room and then opened all of the windows, let all of her friends climb in, and then ended up spending a few days in jail because of it. But it's a really good story. It just goes to show you when she was already thinking. But Kelly, from a very young age, says that she couldn't remember anything. She couldn't remember people's names. She couldn't remember dates. But as a child, her mum would be talking about someone and she would say, oh, was that the girl that was wearing, that pink and yellow spot blouse? And her mum would say, that was 7 years ago. How do you remember what she was wearing? And Kelly couldn't remember her name, but she knew that it was becoming quite evident that she was a great visual thinker. She could think in images and store them. And then obviously that led to her becoming fascinated with homes, interior and architecture. And what a gift she's been to the interior design world. I mean, she literally has done some of the best projects on earth. She's a lovely person and she does what she enjoys every day. She's just remarkable. And she's subsequently been a contributor on BBC Dragon's Den, which is our Shark Tank here in the UK. So she's had this great career and she's creative, she's bubbly, she's lovely. And she was a remarkable contributor to the book.
Yeah, I loved that chapter very much. It reminded me also, I watched a movie recently, Temple Grandin, who is autistic. And in the movie, which I think features Claire Danes, it focused a lot about how she thinks in pictures. Oh. And Kelly also talked about thinking in pictures. I know a lot of artists who do that. I do that. If I need to remember something, I might have a picture in my mind. I'll have to pull that picture up in my picture Rolodex and what was that word on that picture? And then I'll know what it is. Like I'm able to recall something that way, which can be a strength and sometimes, but all the words you need aren't always on a picture. So that's why like the malapropisms happen. Right.
Absolutely. And I must say, I've not heard anybody in my life ever mention that film other than you. So I think it's Temple Grandin Day. And it is one of the most powerful movies that you can ever watch. So if anybody's looking for something to do, bored of flicking through Netflix every Saturday night, I would highly recommend that movie.
Yeah, I had never heard of it either. And I happened to be on a sleepless transatlantic flight where I was, not in first class, 11 hours on a plane. I was like, what am I going to watch? So, that was it. Jamie, it was such a pleasure to have you. I want to tell my listeners The Dyslexic Edge by Jamie Waller, which I'm assuming you can get on Amazon, wherever books are sold.
Yes, wherever other bookshops survive, I guess. You can get it in every major bookshop. You can obviously get it on Amazon and anywhere else online. It's in all formats, in all countries around the world. It was released officially just a couple of weeks ago, so it's selling brilliantly. The reviews are great. And one thing, I'd like to say, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, if there's any of your viewers or listeners that simply want a copy and can't afford a copy, or know somebody that would benefit from a copy, they can just reach out to me. My website is my name, and I will make sure a copy in whatever format is best gets to them. This isn't about selling books. This is really about trying to do something positive in the world of dyslexia.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Jamie. I always told my listeners, just go to the library.
Yeah.
You can request them to buy any book you want if they don't have it already. And don't think that hurts authors. What we really don't make a lot of money off of the books. So it's like maybe 60 cents a copy after you've made back your advance, which takes years. So at this point, what we're most interested in is getting our messages out because of the blood, sweat, and tears that we put into them. All right, Jamie, thank you so much for being here. Do you have any last words for the listeners before we call this podcast complete?
Just, I guess, if you suspect that somebody could be dyslexic, or you suspect yourself, and I do mean anybody from parents right through to children, try and talk to them, get them a copy of the book, try to make them realize living with it in silence really is not living your best life. So we can all have an impact on the positives of dyslexia, not just those of us with dyslexia. So we all have a responsibility to try and help that person that might be suffering silently.
You have a great message, and I know my audience is going to eat it up. And congratulations on writing a book. I know how hard it is. Like all the tears I went after I got the contract, signed, I got this huge advance from HarperCollins. It's like, this is a terrible idea. I forgot I had a learning disability. What makes me think I can write a book? I don't know what I'm signing myself up for. Now I'm doing it again.
Imposter syndrome immediately, right?
Immediately.
Yeah.
Even I had finished the third round of copy edits. How that third round is you're really done. I was like, yeah, I should give my advance back.
I love it.
Okay, friends, I hope you really enjoyed that interview with Jamie Waller. And now we're going to turn to our new segment that we have recently added to the Inspiration Place podcast, which are Artpreneur Deep Dives, courtesy of Notebook LM, which is the software that Jen and I were chatting about during our most recent Kvetch and Cavell episode. So this is a deep dive into Chapter 2 of Artpreneur, which is Break Free of the Golden Handcuffs. And don't forget, you can get Artpreneur wherever books are sold. You can just ask the bookstore to order it for you. If you don't want to buy a book, you can go to your library and get it in that manner by requesting the library to order it for you. Or you can get it on Amazon. It's available there, Kindle, paperback, Audible, and there's a lot of bonuses included. All right, so without further ado, here is our deep dive of Chapter 2.
I never get that pull, to ditch the whole 9-to-5 thing and just become an artist. It's almost like we're all kind of stuck in these golden handcuffs.
It's such a universal feeling, right? Like that deep down desire for a career that actually lights you up.
Totally. And that's exactly what we're diving into today with Miriam Schulman's Artpreneur. Have you gotten a chance to check it out?
That's a good one.
Okay, so Chapter 2. She jumps right into her time on Wall Street working at Salomon Brothers, and she does not hold back. It's intense.
She really paints a picture of this like high stakes pressure cooker, ambition, risk, and a good dose of fear.
It's palpable. And I love that she's so honest about why she ended up there in the first place. It wasn't necessarily some lifelong passion for finance, right?
Right. It was more about like needing that financial security. You know, those student loans aren't going to pay themselves.
Oh, tell me about it. That pressure to make the quote unquote practical choice, even if it means hitting pause on your true passions.
Exactly. And you know what I find refreshing? It's that Schulman is upfront about that. Because here she is outwardly successful, at least on paper, but inside. It's not all coming from this pure place of passion, you know?
Totally. And it makes you wonder how many other people are living with that dissonance.
So many, I bet.
So let's talk about this pressure cooker environment she describes. Schulman talks about this book, Liar's Poker. It was basically like the Bible at Salomon Brothers.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. It was huge EE on Wall Street back in the day.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people saw it as this like how-to guide.
Right. But it's crazy because it's all about like the wild bets, the insane risks, and the cutthroat culture of Wall Street in the 80s.
It really exposes that underbelly of like what people were willing to do to get ahead.
It's almost unfathomable. Like she even mentions this story about the CEO betting, get this, $1 million on a single hand of cards. $1 million.
Talk about high stakes.
Right. Can you even imagine that kind of pressure? And the thing is, this wasn't Vegas. You know, this was Wall Street.
It's different when those bets have real world implications, when people's lives and livelihoods are on the line.
Absolutely. It really gives you a sense of the culture she was walking into.
Intense is an understatement.
Totally. And if that wasn't enough, she goes on to describe her experience during the 1993 World Trade Center bombing.
Oh, gosh.
She was actually in the building.
Wow. Just trying to put myself in her shoes at that moment.
It really highlights how these institutions, they kind of operate in their own bubble, right? Like the expectation to just keep going, to push through like nothing happened, even in the face of something so terrifying. It really makes you question what you're truly sacrificing. It's almost like you become so conditioned to just power through, you know?
It's true. We tell ourselves it's about resilience, but when does resilience cross the line into like ignoring your own needs?
Big questions for sure. And speaking of resilience, so Schulman actually leaves Salomon Brothers, right?
Yeah, she does.
She goes on to this super prestigious hedge fund, LTCM, and she thinks, okay, this is it. This is where I'm going to find that work-life balance, that intellectual stimulation, you know, all the things she felt were missing.
We've all been there thinking, if I could just find that perfect company.
For real. But as we know, it's rarely that straightforward. And Schulman quickly realizes that even at LTCM, those same pressures, they're still there, just maybe dressed up a little differently.
Right, like wolves in sheep's clothing. And she tells this one story about a ski trip with some of the partners at LTCM that really stuck with me.
I remember that one. I think it was a black diamond slope, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Schulman, she's not exactly an expert skier, but she feels this intense pressure to keep up with the partners, right? Like to prove she belongs in this elite group.
Oh, I can only imagine.
So she ends up attempting this black diamond slope, even though it's way beyond her skill level.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And looking back, she admits that she wishes she had spoken up, set some boundaries, maybe even just like walk down the mountain.
It's so easy to say that in hindsight, though, right? When you're not the one in that moment facing those power dynamics.
100%. And I think that's what makes this story so powerful. It reveals those subtle ways we're often pressured to conform, even at the expense of our own well-being.
Absolutely. It's like, how do you say no when your career is on the line, right? When you're trying to climb that ladder.
Exactly. And that pressure, it's especially intense in those high-stakes environments where it feels like everyone is constantly being evaluated.
For sure. And sadly, this whole experience, it becomes a pattern for Schulman. Like, she's constantly trying to find her footing in this world that prioritizes ambition and conformity over, well, pretty much everything else.
It's like she's trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. And then things take a really interesting turn. We have the 1998 hedge fund collapse. Remember how we talked about those high-stakes bets, that too big to fail mentality?
Oh, yeah.
Well, LTCM implodes, and it costs investors billions.
It was huge news.
And not only does Schulman lose a significant amount of money in the collapse, but it also shatters this illusion of security that she's been clinging to.
That's going to be earth-shattering. Like, your whole world just gets flipped upside down.
Totally. And the thing is, even in the face of this financial crisis, well, what's the expectation?
Don't tell me keep going.
Keep going, buckle down, work harder.
It's almost like a broken record at this point, isn't it? This pressure to just push through no matter what.
It is. And I think for Shulman, these external crises, the bombing, the collapse, they start to mirror this internal crisis that's been brewing within her. Like these events force her to confront the reality of her situation, the sacrifices she's making, and the toll it's taking.
It's like, when does it stop, right? Like, when do you finally say enough?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And for Shulman, it's almost like these crises, these wake-up calls, they push her to finally confront that question head on.
Right. By this point, she's a mom. She's disillusioned with this whole corporate world. She's craving something more.
And this is where things start to shift for her. She steps back from that corporate world. She focuses on her family, and she starts to, to really explore her creative side.
It's like she's finally giving herself permission to like tap back into those parts of herself she had pushed aside.
Totally. And then, 9/11 happens.
Yeah. That's obviously a turning point for so many people, Shulman included.
It really is. It's like the universe just delivered this massive wake-up call, this reminder that, like, life is short,
Yeah.
And you can't keep putting your passions on hold.
For sure. And for Shulman, it was like this huge reality check. I mean, she couldn't go back to that world. Not after that.
Especially after connecting the dots, right?
Yeah.
Like the towers collapsing.
Yeah.
It mirrored her own experience with those institutions.
It's true. It's like that visual just like cemented everything for her. This realization that something had to change.
Yeah. And this time, the choice was clear. She goes all in on her art.
And that's where the real hero's journey begins, right? Like she finally answers that call to adventure, even though it's scary.
Totally. And just like those classic heroes, Shulman mentions Dorothy, Harry Potter. She faces those moments of doubt, those challenges. Like she even talks about almost getting sucked back into the corporate world at one point.
I remember that part. It's like those old habits, those fears, they can be so hard to break no matter how much you want to change.
Totally. And that's where her whole concept of thought work comes in.
Yeah.
That's the game changer for her.
It's like reframing those negative thoughts, those what if I fail thoughts into something more empowering.
Exactly. She talks about retraining your brain, essentially, focusing on what's possible instead of getting stuck in that fear.
That makes a lot of sense.
And the best part, these are tools we can all use, whether you're an artist or like totally not. Those negative thought patterns, they're universal.
So true. So for our listeners out there, the ones who are maybe feeling stuck, who are thinking about making a change, what would you say is like the biggest takeaway from Shulman's story?
Honestly, it's that there's never a perfect time to go for it. Like there will always be a reason to play it safe, to stay stuck. But as Shulman shows us, sometimes the biggest risk is not taking a risk at all.
It's about choosing courage over comfort.
And trusting yourself.
Yeah.
Trusting that you have what it takes to figure things out, to navigate the uncertainty.
And knowing that you don't have to do it alone.
Right.
Like find your people, find your support system.
100%. So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a question to sit with. What would you pursue if you knew you couldn't fail? Like what's that thing you keep putting off?
Those are some powerful questions to ponder. And on that note, we'll wrap things up. Until next time, keep exploring, keep creating, and keep chasing those dreams.
All right, my friends. So like I said, if you want to order Artpreneur, you can get it at any bookstore. You can get it at Amazon. And we have lots of bonuses for you. To check out the bonus package, go to artpreneurbook.com or just send us your receipt and you'll find out what those book bonuses are. We can't wait to send them your way. All right, my friends. So thank you so much for being with me here today. I'll see you the same time, same place next week. Until then, stay inspired. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to the Inspiration Place podcast. Connect with us on Facebook at facebook.com/ShulmanArt, on Instagram @ShulmanArt, and of course on ShulmanArt.com.